Welcome to The Explainer, where we break down big ideas. So today we're going to tackle one of the Bible's most difficult topics, a God of wrath. And more importantly, how the Bible itself seems to argue about what that really means. Okay, let's just dive right in with a story that is, frankly, really puzzling. It raises a question that has bothered people for literally thousands of years. Why would a good God make a king sin and then punish the entire country for it? The story comes from the book of Samuel, and it goes like this. We're told God was furious with Israel. So angry, he actually incited King David to take a census of his army. And when David does it, God turns around and sends a plague that kills 70,000 people. I mean, on the face of it, this feels wrong, right? It seems like a total setup. God provokes the sin and then punishes the people for the sin he caused. It seems profoundly unfair, and it just throws this huge question mark over the whole idea of divine justice. And here's the thing, this isn't just some one-off weird story. The ancient texts are actually full of these moments that are really tough for us to read today. Stories about a divine anger that can seem totally random without any clear moral reason behind it.
You kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. The ancient authors were wrestling with the big questions, Why did terrible things happen? Plagues, famines, people just dropping dead. And in a world without science, this idea of blind wrath was one of the main ways they tried to make sense of a really chaotic and often brutal world.
I mean, take this guy Usa. He's just trying to help, right? He sees the sacred Ark of the Covenant about to tumble off a cart, so he reaches out to steady it, and bam, he's struck dead on the spot. Or Korah, who challenges Moses' authority, and the earth literally opens up and swallows him and his family. In this way of seeing the world, God was the direct cause of, well, everything. And this gets us to the heart of a huge theological problem, a big word that scholars use called theodicy. But really, all it means is trying to square a good, all-powerful God with all the evil and suffering we see in the world. And that story about David's census, it's like a textbook example of this problem. So you might be wondering, okay, so did people just have to accept these really difficult stories? Did they just have to live with a God who seemed kind of unjust? Well, no. And this is where our investigation gets really interesting. Later biblical writers were just as troubled by these stories as we are, and they did something pretty incredible about it. Okay, so fast forward hundreds of years after the book of Samuel's written, another author writing the book of Chronicles decides he's going to retell the whole history of Israel. And when he gets to that census story, he makes one tiny but absolutely game-changing edit. Look at this, right here, side by side. The original version in Samuel says, the Lord, inside of David. Plain as day. But in the later version, in Chronicles, the author swaps out the Lord and subs in a brand new character, Satan. Now, this was no accident. It wasn't a typo. This was a conscious, deliberate, theological fix. The writer of Chronicles is basically protecting God's reputation. By making Satan the one who tempts David, God is no longer the source of the sin and the punishment. The whole problem of theodicy is kind of solved by creating a separate source of evil. But blaming an adversary wasn't the only way people started to rethink God's anger. There was another, equally powerful idea developing. What if God's anger wasn't this chaotic, blind force? What if it was actually a passionate, powerful force for justice? So let's look at how this different idea, this concept of righteous wrath, became this incredible source of hope for people fighting against oppression, both way back then and even today.
I mean, this is a raw cry for justice from the Psalms, right? It's a prayer that the wicked will finally get what's coming to them. And get this super ancient verse was actually used by churches in Ukraine right after the Soviet Union collapsed, as a way of calling for divine justice after decades of oppression.
And of course, there's probably the most famous example of all, let my people go. In the book of Exodus, God's anger isn't random. It is aimed like a laser beam right at the oppressor, Pharaoh. This demand became this powerful anthem for enslaved African Americans in the U.S., a real hope that God was on their side in the fight for freedom. So you see what's happening? This totally reframes the whole idea. Divine wrath is no longer this scary theological problem you have to explain away. Instead, it becomes this powerful moral force that you embrace, a belief that the universe ultimately bends toward justice. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that the Bible isn't giving us one simple, flat answer about suffering. What it's actually doing is preserving a conversation, an argument that happened over centuries.
We've seen two completely different models for understanding God's anger living right next to each other in the same collection of books. One is an early attempt to explain chaos. The other is a much more developed idea of God's anger as a moral response to evil.
The fact that these different views are both there shows us that this isn't some static rulebook that just fell from the sky. It's much more like a library, a record of a living tradition that was arguing with itself, that was evolving its understanding of God and justice over hundreds and hundreds of years.
And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. What if the point of all these so-called contradictions isn't for us to pick a side? Maybe it means the conversation about justice, suffering, and the divine is one we are all still meant to be a part of.